Now we're a buck beds and creating buck beds, really creating habitat for buck bedding. You know, a lot of times it's someone putting the cart before the horse, meaning that people focus so much on buck bedding and where they're bedding, and they forget about all the other steps that need to take place to even have that buck bedding condition in the first place. I'll go through those really quickly. So if you're looking for buck beds, if that's important to you, it all starts with food. Food defines where does bed, and once you have doe bedding, then that will define where a buck's going to bed. So if you don't have that food source, if it's not screened, if you're not maintaining a low level of pressure on that food plot, then you're spooking deer further back into the cover. And on a small parcel, it's really easy to run out of cover left over for buck bedding. And it might be on 40 acres that you have that mature buck, he's bedding just inside your neighbors, which is fine in any direction. And we have that here on this parcel. Because if they come on their land, they're just pushing deer back on your property. Those bucks are food focused in the afternoon. They're going through those doe bedding areas. They're heading to that afternoon food source. And I've always found that bucks will cheat towards their afternoon food source a lot more than they will just leave the area. So if they're bedding up on your neighbors push them out, they just slot in tighter to that afternoon food source. But where do they bed? You know, one of the biggest misconceptions out there, I think, is that a buck will always bed downwind of does and doe family groups. If that was the case in large agricultural settings and big open fields, those bucks would always be flip-flopping from one side of the field to the other a half mile and finding new bedding areas. And let's face it, a buck that's flip-flopping and moving bedding areas and moving all over the place all the time, he's not going to get to be 4 or 5 years old. He's going to be shot at some point along the way because he needs to settle into a very remote area like this that he can call his own every single day, regardless of where the wind's coming from. So what I find is really ignore the wind. Now, the one thing about the wind I can say, you know, you're focusing on food, screening along the food, does and fawns bedding as close to that food as possible, and then that leftover room behind is where those bucks are going to be, whatever direction, whatever wind is blowing. The one very important point about wind that I've learned and experienced around the country and hunting public land, private land, doesn't really matter, is that when it gets frigid and cold, you know, a lot of people say, well, that those deer love to bed on that south-facing slope. Well, if you just had a major temperature drop, let's say the temperatures were in the 30s, now it's a high of 12, northwest winds came barreling through, and those deer might have been on that south side to get out of that northwest wind. But now those stable winds come in. And those stable winds are those southerly winds that I find if you look up on Weather Underground, you look at historical wind data for your area, you're going to find that southerly winds are going to be present about 35% of the time. The other winds, you know, the rest of the time. East winds, every time a front comes through, there's the east wind. After a cold front goes through, temperatures drop. Let's say it dropped to a high of 12. That's the lowest that it got to. Well, let's say it's inched up to 17, 18 degrees and you have heavy southwest winds, 25-mile-an-hour winds. Those deer are not going to be bedding on those south-facing slopes no matter how much sunlight that they're getting, because that amount of sunlight and the warmth from that sun cannot overcome the 25-mile-an-hour, 18-degree heavy negative wind chills that are going to be slamming into those deer. I've seen deer in the UP of Michigan that were exposed. You've probably seen deer that their tips of the ears are off. It's not that they lost them in a fight, they were probably frostbit. Most of the time deer are smart enough to get on the lee side of the hill no matter which way it's facing. In fact, this is facing northwest. You can see a lot of the buck activity through here. These bucks are simply bedding here because there's food down there, there's does down in the bowl, and these bucks can rise up into this location. This is a great buck bedding area. You can see all the rubs around here. It's northwest facing. I can guarantee if there's a heavy northwest wind, those deer are probably just going down the bowl right here, going up the other side 250 yards away, and they're out of the wind, and then that's northeast facing. So they're not getting any sun in here, but we have consistent bucks in here. There's a bowl just like it up and over the ridge on the other side and down. That's the bowl where my mature bucks came that I shot last year up on the point up high. Again, when you're thinking about bucks and wind, don't think about where they're downwind of those does and where they're positioned by bedding. Think food, screening, does and fawns, young bucks, and then there's room for those mature bucks. That's where you start looking at them. You can apply that to public land, private land, wherever you're at. And while you're at it, Think about how those deer need to get out of the wind when the temperatures are frigid, and you'll be on track for finding buck beds going into this season, your scouting season, your off season. We're in mid-May right now. We have 40-degree temperatures today. The wind's blowing pretty heavy. We're out in the woods. Great time to scout this time of year. I urge you to scout, look for it. Those post-winter trails are starting to cover up now with the new growth, so don't miss out. Hope you guys have a great season. Make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't done so already. I'll try to bring you as much in-depth strategy content as I can throughout this entire 2019 season.